webinar will examine what has changed in the ESOP landscape and how small and large Indian startups are already benefiting from those changes. This will provide us the answers, the questions like, can ESOP be viewed as a hiring currency? How traditional structure can be tweaked to make them suitable for that? And when and how much can this currency be used? To answer all these questions, I welcome Mr. Harshu Gate, who is Managing Director, ESOP Direct and ESOP Easy. To introduce Harshu, Harshu is a qualified chartered accountant and company secretary, having more than 35 years of professional career. He dabbled into several ventures as a partner to promoter, having competencies in finance, corporate law, and management consultancy. 21 years back, he co-founded ESOP Direct and ESOP Easy a year back. He strongly believes in sticking to core competency, specializing in niche area, and striving to be a leading player in whatever area we work. He proved it, and when we see it, the leadership position of ESOP Direct. I welcome and request Harishu to please take over and take us to the today's topic, using ESOP as a hiring currency. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Shashank, and very good afternoon to all the participants. Had it not been the impact of COVID and pandemic, I would have loved to have a face-to-face interaction with all of you. So as Shashank mentioned, the topic we have today is using ESOPs as a hiring currency. And I would like to start this discussion with a basic question as to whether ESOP is a currency at all. We'll talk about it. And if at all we believe that it is a currency, hiring currency, then what are the limitations, or what are the situations in which it may work, and what are the situations it may not work. We thought about this topic because, as all of you must have read and heard, I mean, there is a ESOPs are on the center page of every business newspaper these days for several reasons. Companies providing a lot of liquidity, companies covering large number of employees, companies consistently increasing their ESOP pool. So it's been in the news for various reasons, and with the kind of talent war that we have, I think companies are going aggressive and overboard in terms of using ESOPs to attract and retain people. So we'll look at even some of those practices, and what are the limitations and what are the ways in which it can work better. Just to set the context, I mean, this is the overall macroeconomic scenario. We are looking at a very positive growth in this year as well as in the coming years. We have seen last year India being the highest destination for startup investments. Obviously, as a after effect of that, we have also seen raging war for talent. This is more pronounced in the information technology area, but we also see it in the other areas where companies are looking at ramping up quite fast. And as I said, the way ESOPs are in the news these days, and the variety of news reasons for which it is in the news, I think the question also to be asked is whether it is being used and seen more as a glamorous tool. So we'll address all of that. Coming specifically to the context of this webinar, as I said, I would like to start with a basic question of whether ESOPs is a currency at all, and if so, whether it's a right one for the cause or for the objective for which it is used now. And going on the premise that yes, to some extent with some tweaking, ESOPs can be used as a currency, then how can we tweak the traditional structures that we are used to and the regulators are used to in order to make them work in a given situation? And also, what are the prerequisites which will make it work? Because end of the day, everybody, including the founders, shareholders, investors, employees, everybody is looking at any structure or a solution so that it can work. And when I say it should work for all the stakeholders, not only employees or not only employers, but everyone, including the regulators. So let's look at this, deep dive into this. Coming first to the topic on whether ESOPs is a currency at all, and there is obviously not a clear yes or a clear no answer. So if you were to just look at argument where we say that ESOPs is not a currency, I mean, some of the reasons are there is no instant realization. As we all know, ESOPs is a long-term instrument. It has a vesting period. So it's not something that you just surrender your options and you get cash for it. There is no fixed value. So it's not convertible straight away for the same value at every point in time. The change in value can be quite significant. Either way, it can drop significantly or it can go up significantly, which does not normally happen with a traditional currency. Options are not tradable. So as I said, these are not instantly encashable. So they are not tradable like other instruments. And also the realization is conditional. I mean, just because somebody has got options doesn't mean that he is entitled to that value or that wealth. There are some conditions attached to the vesting. So for these reasons, I believe ESOPs cannot be called as a currency. However, there are equal number of reasons why we can say that ESOPs is a currency. Firstly, it is a convertible, though it is in the nature of an option, it's a convertible currency into cash, near cash, we can say. It is cash for the listed ones. Unlisted ones, it is near cash because there is no liquidity for the shares. Liquidity events, which we see quite frequently being used now, brings ESOP closer to, closer to make it like a cash instrument. And even though these are not tradable across the counter or across the board, it is still a monetizable asset. So to that extent, we can call it as a currency or a pseudo currency. And it is also less speculative than a stock market because I'm talking more in the context of unlisted companies where the variation in the value is not, the volatility is not that high. So if you were to sort of answer this question, there is no clear answer whether ESOPs is a currency or not a currency, or whether it can be used as a currency or not. I think the answer lies in the context or in a situation where ESOPs are being used. Having said that, let's proceed with the argument that we do treat ESOPs in any form as something as close to a currency, though not a complete convertible currency. Having said that, okay, to some extent we can say ESOPs is a currency. Whether it is a right currency for hiring is the next logical question. And there are two elements to this. One is related to the servicing of ESOPs. So as we all know, equity settled ESOPs lead to, they create new equity. Equity in any business is a permanent source of capital. Once you create it, it survives the entire life of the company. So once you create equity, it needs to be serviced for the lifetime. This is not like any other cash instrument where you just pay and you are done with. Once you give equity to employees, you have to service that equity lifelong. So in that way, we have to see whether ESOPs is the right currency for hiring key talent. In case of cash settled options, though, the cash payout is more like a OPEX because you don't create any long-term liability. Once these options are settled, they don't create any equity or a long-term commitment to service. So maybe cash settled options could be seen as a hiring currency, which do not lead to creating permanent equity. From a compensation point of view, I think it is very important, and this is very core to the way companies or especially the HR functions look at ESOPs. What is important here is to match the service delivered with the reward. So there are some services which are delivered with a long-term value or a long-term impact. For example, if you are creating a product or something from a scratch, you are creating something which will create a long-term value. And obviously, in order to match that, the resources also need to be rewarded over a long term and not in the short term. Whereas services which are delivered with a short term value or a short term impact, they need to be compensated short term. So just like you cannot have a short term reward for a long term impact, you also should not have a long term reward for a short term impact or a short term delivery, service delivered. So matching this service delivery, a service create or a value creation to the reward is very essential. And many times companies and the HR professionals overlook this. So just to answer this question, whether it is the right hiring currency, so depending upon the situation, equity or cash could be a right hiring currency. I'll come to these situations in the subsequent slides, where we'll address this, in which situations it can be used as a hiring currency. We spoke about the long term, the matching of reward and the expectations of the service delivery. Now, what we see is, we all know that ESOPs is a long term reward, because the core objective of ESOPs is to not only aim at a long term performance, but a sustained long term performance. I think that is very important. The real value creation in ESOPs only becomes when one were to look at or evaluate a 5 to 7 year performance. And ESOPs structurally are different than the normal cash incentives or the yearly bonuses that we have. And it will be a mistake if we were to say that we are replacing yearly or a quarterly incentive with ESOPs, because their purpose is significantly different. On the other hand, what we have and what we see very regularly, more pronounced in the current scenario, is the expectations of employees are getting more and more short term and more, so to say, opportunistic. So the job tenures are reducing. In the pandemic, we saw severe salary cuts. We also saw people losing out on their normal incentives. So the expectations were that how can that loss be compensated? So that is a short-term expectation which employees had. So balancing these long-term reward, that is ESOPs, with the expectations which people have, which are becoming shorter and shorter, is the core of this problem statement as to how we can, whether we can or how we can use ESOPs as a currency. Now, as I said, finding this balance is difficult. One can also start questioning whether it is desirable, whether we should even attempt finding the balance, which in turn means that should ESOPs be used at all as short-term reward while you create permanent equity? So is it desirable? Or, is a better way out to manage the short-term expectations which employees have, either through a better communication or a better education, a better awareness amongst the employees on their short-term focus. This is obviously a very difficult task, and not very easy for companies to convince employees on changing their expectations. But I think not much has been done by companies in terms of even attempting to sort of create that awareness. Obviously, we have seen many times people getting carried away by the different the way news is published about companies giving out so much money to employees through ESOP liquidity programs, etc. So it's a slightly difficult, but I think it is all the more important for companies to make a serious attempt. So as I said, this balancing this is important, though it is difficult. I'm going to the next slide where we are saying how we can attempt to achieve this balance. So as I said, matching the long-term impact with a long-term reward and short-term impact with a short-term reward is the right approach to this. And if we are expecting a long-term impact from the services or from the tenure of employees, retention of employees, etc., they should be compensated with a long-term reward. But if you are expecting just some correction in the pay or just a short term. I mean, I also heard companies giving ESOPs as a sign up, bonuses, which is like real short term. You are actually creating a long term commitment for just hiring people, or giving them some sign on bonuses, which should ideally be given in cash. The incorrect and the undesirable way of using this is, if your expectation is to get a long term service benefit, and you reward it with short term, which is cash. Whereas if you have a short term service, you are rewarding it with a long term reward, which is ESOP. So that is obviously not the right way, and I think each company will have to figure out as to what are they trying to what kind of service or what kind of contribution from employees are they trying to reward by giving ESOPs. Is this something which is real short term, or is this something which is a long term impact or a long term service? And depending upon that, the instrument, whether it should be cash or ESOPs, can be decided. As I said, when I say cash here, it can also mean cash settled options. So, like we saw in some situations in the pandemic, where companies who could not afford to pay salaries on a monthly basis, some of them issued options which would have a vesting, say, after 15 months or 18 months, so that companies don't have to pay immediate salaries of full nature, maybe 50% lower. But at the end of 15 months or 18 months, all of that got compensated or paid out. So it was like a deferment of salary, but through a commitment of a ESOP, which I think was a very innovative and a very nice way of handling the situation. So cash settled options, I think, is a good via media for companies who want to use ESOPs. The next question is, in which situations and how much can we use this instrument? So if we were to use equity as a short-term reward, which I think is a current problem on hand, because companies are in the race to recruit resources, and they are using ESOPs to attract those resources. So, which I feel is a very short-term reward. It is more like a signing bonus, not really focusing too much on whether the employee would stay for a 3, 5, 7 year period or not. So if in the current situation we have to use equity for a short-term reward, you can classify situations into exceptional situations and sort of a steady state situations. So in exceptional situations where, what we just saw in the last 2 years, adverse business impact environment, and there is a cash crunch within the company. So obviously in those situations, cash is costlier than equity, and companies did use equity, and they should use equity because it was an exceptional situation. However, what is important is we should match the term. As I said, if you're looking at, typically I think companies took a view that the pandemic impact would be there for, say, 15, 18 months, and we should be back to normal in that period. So they timed their cash payout or liquidity in such a way that, they could settle out that liability in that period, so that there is no ongoing impact or the long-term impact for the companies. So matching the term is very important. At the same time, since you are handling a exceptional situation, giving that certainty to the employee that this is not something which is shot in the dark, where employees are not sure whether they'll see any cash at the end of the day because shares are not tradable. You don't know whether the value will go up. So there is a lot of uncertainty. But since you are compensating for a loss of pay, I think it is important that employees get certainty about the liquidity, though it may mean that they'll get liquidity after, say, 15 or 18 months. Obviously, since the objective is to compensate for the loss of pay, it will be quite fair for companies to keep a upper and lower cap. So if, for example, after 18 months, some of the businesses still did not do well, so there could be a lower cap. And if some businesses really took off, say after 12 months, 15 months, and they really turned around quite fast, they may say that we'll cap the return, so that there is no extra pressure on the liquidity. So with this use of caps and quantity, it will be possible to match the reward with the compensation which is foregone by the employees. And as I said, preference should be to use cash settled options rather than equity, because you need not create any permanent liability to be serviced. If you look at non-exceptional situations, which is, I think, many of the businesses are coming back to the pre-COVID situations in terms of their operations, profitability, cash flows, etc. So this is we can say, a steady state kind of a situation where equity is always costlier than cash, and where now you are again focusing to drive sustained long-term growth. So here the situation is quite different, where you can use equity to drive performance, to link reward to long-term performance. So this is a long-term reward linked to long-term performance, and equity is the most ideal instrument there. And here I think it is important that if the idea is to ensure a sustained long-term growth, it's critical that you grant in good quantities, so that higher value can be created, and a higher deterrent can also be created if somebody were to leave the organization. So depending upon where you see your business in, whether you are in an exceptional situation or whether you are back to normal steady state level, one can choose which instrument, or what tenures, or what kind of liquidity you can provide to employees. Finally, I have some thoughts on the current scenario, the way we see this whole instrument being used, or to some extent misused by companies. So, as I said, during the pandemic period, and some of the companies are still in that period, not yet completely come out. Companies went out for pay cuts, and there was cash crunch, and they used ESOPs to compensate for loss of pay, which was very well justified. Even if they used equity at that time, it was justified because it was really a question of survival. Though what we see is not all companies did the matching of term. So, some companies issued options which will vest after 3-4 years, whereas employees would want to sort of compensate for their loss of pay as soon as things get back to normal. So some companies did stretch it a bit longer, but quite a few companies did provide liquidity immediately after things started coming back to normal. So this, I think, was a welcome trend. I think companies who did who committed long-term vesting or a long-term reward, or the pay cuts which employees had done, I think it was a slightly unfair for the employees. For those of us who are now back to normal, we still have a situation on hand in terms of war for talent, and depending on the business, it can be very serious to more serious. And on the other hand, we are also seeing a spurt in the growth, and in some sectors have gone past the COVID levels already. In which case, as we said, ESOPs should be used. And here one can look at, if you are looking at a situational demand based on the industry that you are in, you may decide, or you may want to spread the coverage wider. And this can be done if you go for appropriate design of the options or the instrument, wherein you can achieve the objective across the organization than just a handful of people benefiting out of it. There is obviously a dilemma that if you cover too many people, can you give them enough equity? That is a question, and that is something that each business will have to decide, whether you want to go more broad-based, or you want to give it for select few. But with the use of right instruments, we believe that even a broad-based coverage can be evaluated. So that is all I had to share in this webinar. Thank you. Thank you very much.